I do know that some people bypass Dreamweaver's design view entirely and only use the code view section where they can edit their CSS, their HTML, their JavaScript, whatever coding language they'd like to be using manually just by typing it all in. So a few things that I do want to bring up in regards to dealing with the HTML specifically is that Dreamweaver's code editor includes a lot of professional features like customizable syntax highlighting. You can automatically indent. It provides you line numbering and code hits, and it adds a lot of other really flexible elements pertaining to code editing specifically. So while I do know that I focus a fair amount on the design view area for designers that are newer and perhaps don't have as strong of a background in HTML and editing in code view in general, there are a lot of HTML tools designed for designers that prefer to work in that method as well. A few things that Dreamweaver offers is it can automatically fix your code on your behalf. These can include things like where tags may overlap with one another, tags that perhaps did not end up being closed, like I did right here. I deleted that bracket, or adding extra closing tags on accident. By default, these particular items aren't always turned on. I do believe that this autofix feature initially starts as being turned off, but you can get to that by editing your preferences. If you click on Edit in a PC or on Mac, you would click on the Dreamweaver title and preferences are going to be there. And under the Preferences panel, I'm going to click on the section that has Code Rewriting. So I can rewrite that code to fix nested and unclosed tags, remove extra closing tags. There's also a checkbox that can warn you when fixing or removing tags should Dreamweaver want to do that. By default, these do come turned off, so you can turn that on just to act as an extra precaution to ensure that no problems pop up as you type content in by hand, because I do know we all mistype things on occasion. It's just a fact of the matter. There are also options here to allow for special characters to be recognized. So that does come turned on. And you can specify whether or not you want to encode those particular items. This middle one tends to be the best out of these three options. So I'll click Apply and then close out of it. When dealing with viewing the HTML in code view, and I'll shrink this over just a touch so we can focus on this section. As we discussed previously, you can look at code exclusively, you can look at design or live view exclusively. I have a tendency to split it just because I like to see what I change here and how that relays over on this side. But a few things that you will notice that Dreamweaver takes care of you off the bat. It does color code your syntax. So if you take a look, all of your tags are going to be listed in blue. Your reference content, titles, links to file types or links outside of the document, units of measurement, these tend to all be in orange. Properties that are being altered are listed in green, and same thing goes with CSS. Any problem areas are going to be highlighted in red, both in the line number as well as in the area that you need to focus on. So looks like I had a couple selectors there that were giving me some problems. If you run into areas where there are problematic regions, such as you've typed incorrect code, this can pertain to a tag that wasn't properly closed or something that's been improperly nested. This happens with CSS as well. It's going to highlight that error. So if I click, you'll notice I'm getting a red number line here. And if I hover over that, it's going to tell me what that problem is. So it's expecting another right bracket brace at this line. I think this is giving me issues because I don't have a selector being used here or any styles. I don't have any styles being applied to this selector. So if I maybe just close out of that now, that isn't giving me an issue any longer. Some other options, you'll notice here along the far left, there are some tools present. And down here at the bottom, there are quite a few more tools that you can use to customize your code as you work. Now, depending on what you have got selected or even what view you happen to be working in, this area does alter based on how it thinks you're going to be designing. Now, the textbook has a lovely little chart on page 329 that actually breaks down what each and every one of these icons do. Some of them are pretty simple, like adding or removing indents for your code, like they've done up here for these list items, allowing you to select parent tags by moving up through the grouping, options for live mode. So these all do something a little different. I'll click on some of them momentarily, but you can entirely customize what's visible here based on checking or removing the checkbox from this list. A few other areas that you'll want to look at, you'll notice when I click on any of these lines, I get a little arrow, or a little triangle rather, that points downwards. This lets me collapse that code into an easier to digest chunk or expand it. So this can allow for me to maybe focus on just a specific area. Not only can I do that line by line, but I can highlight entire groups of content and highlight all of it as a single unit. So let's say I wanted to hide all of my major paragraphs and only deal with maybe the address and the navigation at the top. If I click that singular arrow, it collapses line 29 to 35 and just condenses that HTML to give me a little bit less to look at. Now that doesn't at all affect the visual here. That just lets me condense the code content enough to where if I am editing by hand, it gives me a little less overwhelming amounts of content to review so that I can focus more on the regions that I do want to edit. There are options to apply or remove comments. Comments are kind of like this little guy here. It can be directions telling you what certain chunks of code represent. It can be something that if you're working collaboratively with another designer, it can be a note to that designer. If I just want to hide a chunk of code, maybe I'm not using the navigation bar at the moment, I can actually highlight that and turn it into an HTML comment or a CSS comment. These are all for different coding languages. I'll pick HTML. And what that does is it hides that. I haven't deleted it. It does take it visually off of my design page, but it's just turning whatever I highlighted into a comment as opposed to something that's going to appear visually, just so I can hide it temporarily. This can be a good way to try out different designs and then, but perhaps not delete them. And by removing that comment, it returns it to how it was. There we go, how it was initially. Code hints are wonderful. I enjoy the code hint feature quite a bit because it can allow you to make specific changes. So let's say I want to add in an additional line, and I'm going to continue to alter my navigation. By setting up that bracket, it automatically gives you an alphabetical list of all the different tags you can use. So if I wanted to make another list item, I can just type L and it gets me ready for all of that stuff. And it actually If I use my arrows on my keyboard, it's going to tell you what each of these represents as well. Close my tag. I'll just type something else in. And then when I hit that backslash, it automatically closes the last tag used on your behalf. So code hints are just super great to use in this program because it does help to anticipate what you're wanting to make alterations to. And this goes for all of the different coding languages that you might be using. They have the same code hints that pop up in CSS as well. So if I wanted to do another property, maybe I want to alter the margin of my images, and then I'll type in a unit of measurement. I have to close it off with a semicolon. And it was a subtle change, but you could actually see that image offset just a touch. So you can see if I redo that, see how it bounces in. Also visible just above the HTML or the code window. Up here, these are referencing your related files to whatever document you happen to have open. So the source code pertains directly to the HTML document, but it also shows that I have my CSS page. And right here, it's having a hard time finding it at the moment, but this pertains to that font that we had imported a few videos previously when we were using the designer to style some of the fonts that we had. Let's go back. So we had used the cooperblack.std, and so that's, there we go. So it gives in just a touch of JavaScript to control how that font happens to be displaying. So that's why those are there, as pertaining specifically to bringing in that Adobe font as a reference. So any other coding files that you need in order to control the content on your web page, whether it's CSS, JavaScript, PHP, or other languages, all associated files are going to be displayed up at the top in this toolbar. Now, designing pages in live view. Oh, I'll switch back to split, make sure that we're in live. We know we're in live because our bacon GIF is dancing. So designing in live mode's a little bit trickier. It does give you a little bit more of an accurate representation in terms of fonts that are being used and how certain things are going to react with one another. But as mentioned previously, it isn't quite as easy where you can just type in and then go and start manipulating the content. It's not quite as simple. So if you do prefer working in live mode, these are the basic stages that you're going to be using. You'll insert your HTML structural elements. So think your div tags, your paragraphs, your headings, header, navigation, etc., etc. When you click that, it's going to prompt you how you want to use it. Where do you want to enter it? Before wherever you had selected, after whatever you had selected. I think I was selected after this P tag here. Wrap it in that item or nest it inside of. So around the outside of that item or the inside of that item. If I click nest, or wrap rather, you'll notice that it put the main div outside of that P tag. So it does narrow down that scope a touch. After structural elements are added, placing in items like images and graphics would come secondary. And then at that point, you can apply some CSS formatting. If I click this little icon with the bars, it's going to give me options pertaining specifically to that image itself. This is all the same sort of stuff that's listed in that properties panel. The little plus sign lets me apply a class or an ID. So rather than opening up my CSS designer and typing something there, or rather than coming down to the properties panel and applying something there, I can actually click right here and give it a class or an ID, and I can select, do I want to apply it to a source? Do I want to define it in the page, create a new file, etc.? And if I'm using media queries, which we are not yet, but should that happen, I could apply it there as well. We'll get into what media queries are and why they're relevant later on in another lecture. Now at this point, since I've applied, in this case a class, to that image, then I could go into the CSS designer and begin making alterations to how I'd like that to appear. So something to keep in mind if you are using the ability to insert content while designing in live mode, you want to pay attention to the order. The order of these elements is critical to the look and logic of your web page. So that before after rapid nest icon that pops up, this is going to be important because you would want to, put your paragraphs and content wrapped inside of divs or nested within divs as opposed to being on the outside. So it's going to be important to be conscientious of that. I personally think that designing in live mode can be a little bit tricky. I prefer to work in design just because I can, drag content around a little bit easier. And at times that can be more along the lines of how I'd like to make some alterations. But again, it tends to be a personal preference. So just to be aware of the differences between those two. Now, something to keep in mind, the busier your web page gets, the tougher it is to get a complete picture of the way the HTML tags interact with one another. Because, you've got paragraph tags inside of other tags, inside of div tags, inside of your body tag, and it can become overwhelming at times. So down here at the bottom, this is your tag selector. So this can give you sort of a bird's eye view, regardless of any view that you're in, whether you're in code view, live view, split view, any of those. This can give you the opportunity to kind of work your way up within a document. So I clicked on my bacon image. That bacon image is also nested inside of the P tag, and that P tag is nested inside of the body tag. So this can let you select broader scopes of content without a lot of extra work. Now keep in mind, this won't list every HTML item on the page. It's only going to list items that are part of the selected element. So if I click on this sublist item, it's the list item inside of an order list, which is inside of another list item, which is inside of the navigation unordered list. So it's not going to give me a list of every item on the page, only the hierarchy that I happen to be working with based on the item or the specific element that I have selected at that point in time. Lastly, something to keep in mind, one of the tools over here that can be really helpful. Inspect mode is an option that's only available when you're viewing in live that can give you, again, a little bit more of a bird's eye view of what you are dealing with in regards to your content. So this lets you hover over specific items and it gives you information about each region you're dealing with. So the blue represents the content area itself, whether that's a picture or a paragraph or a header, your navigation. You'll see that here in my list items, it's telling me I've got a little bit of space around each of these icons. The orange is the margin that has been applied. So it's the space between this content and the next content. You'll notice that I had put that margin around each of my images, and that's what that little orange outline happens to be. So that represents the space between each icon. If you look right here, the green represents padding, which is going to also help control content placement, but that doesn't pertain to necessarily the space between the navigation bar and the next item down. So this can, at times if something is placed in an odd location and you're not quite sure why it's not where you think it ought to be located, this can often give you a little bit more inclination as to what's going on and why it looks the way it looks. To turn that off, just click that little crosshair or bullseye there, and that shuts that down. There are lots of really useful tools that are available. These are just a few of them. We will go into more detailed options later on in other lectures, but for those of you that do prefer to work specifically in code view, there are quite a few options available to you in order to make your life editing in this fashion with Dreamweaver a little bit easier.